The smell of rain-soaked earth rose from the cracked ground as Sarah Mitchell stood before the rusted gate of her family's abandoned farm, clutching the key that had arrived with her father's will like it might burn through her palm. 15 years she'd been gone, 15 years since she'd sworn never to return. Now, as a widow at 42, she had nowhere else to go. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the overgrown fields as Sarah pushed open the gate. It groaned in protest, the sound echoing across the empty property. The farmhouse stood a quarter-mile down the dirt drive, its weathered clapboard siding peeling like old scabs, windows dark and vacant as blind eyes. Beyond it, the massive oak tree she'd climbed as a child still reached skyward, though one of its great limbs had fallen, creating a jagged wound in its silhouette. Sarah adjusted the strap of her worn leather bag and began the walk toward the house, each step stirring memories she'd fought to bury. The weight of her husband Richard's funeral 2 months earlier still pressed down on her shoulders. The medical bills had drained their savings, and the city apartment had become a luxury she could no longer afford. The farm, her inheritance and her burden, was now her only option. The key slid into the front door lock with resistance. Sarah had to lean her weight against the swollen wood, pushing until it finally gave way. The musty scent of abandonment greeted her, along with the hollow echo of her footsteps on the hardwood floor. Sheets draped the sparse furniture like ghosts of a life long past. "Home sweet home," she muttered, her voice sounding foreign in the empty space. Sarah moved through the front room toward the kitchen, trailing her fingertips along the wall where family photos once hung. Her father had taken them down after her mother's death, unable to bear their silent witness. Now, faded rectangles marked their absence, like shadows of forgotten happiness. The kitchen sink dripped steadily, the sound amplified in the stillness. Sarah turned the faucet, surprised when rusty water sputtered forth. At least the well still worked. Her father had always boasted about the depth of that well, how it had never run dry even during the worst drought. "Mitchell water runs deep," he'd say, just like Mitchell stubbornness. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah ventured upstairs, each step on the staircase announcing her presence to the empty house. Her old bedroom remained largely untouched, faded blue wallpaper with tiny silver stars, a twin bed with a quilt her grandmother had made, bookshelves lined with tattered novels and school trophies. It was as if her father had preserved this space while erasing her from the rest of the house. A wave of exhaustion washed over her. She sank onto the bed, dust billowing around her. The last time she'd slept here was the night before she'd run away with Richard, 22 years old, headstrong, determined to escape the suffocation of rural life and her father's iron grip. "You leave now, you stay gone," her father had shouted as she'd thrown her bags into Richard's waiting car. She thought it an empty threat, one he'd take back once the anger faded. But James Mitchell had meant every word. Not a single call returned, not a single letter answered, until the day she'd received news of his death 3 months ago. Now, as darkness fell across the farm, Sarah was surrounded by the silence of 15 years of abandonment. She thought her father had died bitter and alone, but the will had revealed something strange. "The farm goes to Sarah," it had stated simply, and with it, the contents of the well. Sarah had assumed it meant the water itself, her father's roundabout way of acknowledging the value of the property's most reliable feature. But her father's lawyer, old Mr. Grayson, had looked at her strangely when reading that line. "The contents of the well," he'd repeated, his weathered brow furrowing. "Are you sure you don't know what he meant by that?" She dismissed his concern. Her father had always been cryptic, especially in his final years according to the few townsfolk who'd kept in touch with her despite her exile. Sarah switched on the bedside lamp, grateful that the electricity still worked. She unpacked her meager belongings, hanging clothes in the closet that still held a few of her teenage garments. The juxtaposition was jarring, silk blouses from her life in Chicago next to faded denim and flannel from her farm days. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through cracks in the window frames. Sarah wrapped herself in her grandmother's quilt and tried to sleep, but her mind raced with the enormity of what lay ahead. The farm needed extensive repairs before it could be sold. The fields had gone fallow years ago when her father's health had begun to decline. There was the question of the equipment, the property taxes, and a mortgage she wasn't sure had ever been paid off. And there was the well. The well her father had specifically mentioned. Morning arrived with harsh sunlight streaming through uncovered windows. Sarah dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, stopping in the kitchen long enough to boil water on the ancient stove for instant coffee she'd packed in her bag. The bitter liquid warmed her as she stepped onto the back porch, surveying what was now hers. The barn stood 100 yards away, its red paint faded to a dull rust. The chicken coop had collapsed entirely. And beyond the main structures, partially hidden by tall grass and weeds, sat the stone well that had provided water to Mitchell land for generations. Sarah's feet carried her toward it without conscious thought. The well had always been her favorite spot on the farm as a child. Its rough stone walls, cool to the touch even in summer heat, had been her refuge when she needed escape from chores or her father's stern presence. She would sit with her back against it, reading books or simply watching clouds drift across the vast Kansas sky. As she approached now, something seemed different. The well had always been open, its depth protected only by a wooden cover her father would slide aside when drawing water. Now, there was a heavy metal lid secured with a rusted padlock. What on earth? Sarah whispered, kneeling to examine the lock. It was relatively new, certainly not 15 years old. Her father had placed it there more recently, which meant he had been concerned about keeping something out, or keeping something in. Didn't expect to see you back here. The voice startled Sarah. She whirled around to find a man standing at the edge of the overgrown garden, a shotgun resting casually in the crook of his arm. It took her a moment to recognize him beneath the weathered face and salt and pepper beard. Mike Lawson, she said, rising slowly to her feet. Still trespassing after all these years? The hint of a smile crossed his face. Not trespassing when you're invited. Your father asked me to keep an eye on the place after he got sick. Didn't change that arrangement when he died. Mike had been her neighbor, her childhood friend, and briefly, her first love before life had pulled them in different directions. He'd stayed in Oak Ridge while she'd fled to Chicago, married Richard, built a career, and then watched it all slowly crumble as Richard's illness consumed their lives. I didn't know, Sarah said, suddenly aware of how the property didn't show 15 years of complete neglect. The grass was long but not impenetrable. The driveway had been kept clear enough for a vehicle. Even the house, for all its disrepair, had been maintained at some basic level. Your father was a proud man, Mike said, walking closer. He nodded toward the well. I see you found his project. Project? Mike's expression grew serious. About 5 years ago, your father started acting strange. More reclusive than usual. He had me help him put that lid on the well, made me swear not to ask questions. He paused, studying her face. Then he made me promise that if anything happened to him, I'd make sure you came back to deal with it. Deal with what? Sarah asked, a chill running through her despite the morning warmth. He wouldn't say. Just that it had to be family. Had to be you. Mike shifted the shotgun to his other arm. Whatever's down there, Sarah, it spooked him. And James Mitchell wasn't a man who spooked easily. Sarah looked back at the padlocked well, her father's words from the well echoing in her mind. The contents of the well. Not the water, but something specific. Something that required a heavy metal lid and a lock. Something that could only be entrusted to family. Do you have the key? She asked. Mike shook his head. Your father kept it. Said you'd know where to find it when the time came. But Sarah didn't know. She'd been gone too long, had become a stranger to this place and the man who had lived and died here alone. I need to get into that well, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. You sure about that? Mike's eyes narrowed slightly. Some things, once you see them, you can't unsee. It's my inheritance, Sarah replied. Whatever's down there, my father wanted me to find it. Mike sighed, glancing at the shotgun in his arms as if suddenly aware of how threatening he must appear. I can help you break that lock, if that's what you want. But I'm not sure it's what you need. What I need, Sarah said, is to understand why he called me back here after 15 years of silence. As they walked back toward the house to search for tools, Sarah felt the weight of her father's final request settling on her shoulders. Whatever lay at the bottom of that dry well had been important enough for James Mitchell to break his vow of never contacting her again. Important enough to become the final connection between father and daughter. And as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting the shadow of the old oak across the farmyard, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the contents of the well would change everything, not just her understanding of her father, but her understanding of why she'd been drawn back to the place she'd fought so hard to escape. The rusty toolbox from the barn yielded a pair of bolt cutters, their handles wrapped in fraying electrical tape. Sarah held them tentatively, eyeing the padlock on the well with growing apprehension. Mike stood a few paces back, watching her with an unreadable expression. You sure about this? He asked again. Your father went to a lot of trouble to seal that well. Sarah tightened her grip on the bolt cutters. I don't have much choice. Whatever's down there, he left it for me to find. The morning had warmed considerably, the Kansas sun beating down on her shoulders as she knelt before the well. The padlock was weather-beaten but solid, the kind used to secure valuable equipment. Sarah positioned the bolt cutters and squeezed with all her strength. The metal groaned but held. Let me, Mike said, stepping forward. He took the tool from her hands, his calloused fingers brushing against hers briefly. With a single powerful motion, he snapped the lock. It fell to the ground with a dull thud. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as she lifted the heavy metal lid. It took both of them to slide it aside, revealing the dark mouth of the well beneath. The stone walls disappeared into shadow, the bottom invisible from their vantage point. A musty, earthy smell rose from the depths. Your father had me help him lower something down there about 4 years back, Mike said quietly, standing at her shoulder. A metal box, sealed tight. Never told me what was in it. 4 years ago? Sarah looked up at him. That would have been right before his heart attack. Mike nodded. The first one, yeah. Doctor told him to take it easy after that, but he was obsessed with that well. I'd catch him out here sometimes, just staring down into it like he was looking for something to come back up. Sarah shivered despite the heat. We need a flashlight. Got one in my truck. While Mike retrieved the flashlight, Sarah peered into the well, trying to penetrate its darkness. The well had been hand-dug generations ago, when her great-grandfather had first established the farm. Its walls were lined with fitted stone, creating a perfect cylinder descending deep into the earth. As a child, she dropped pebbles down it, counting the seconds until she heard the distant splash. But there was no water now. According to the property assessment that had accompanied the will, the aquifer had receded years ago, rendering the well useless for irrigation. The farm's water now came from a modern drilled well on the north side of the property. Mike returned with a powerful flashlight and handed it to her. Be careful now. That ledge isn't as stable as it used to be. Sarah switched on the light and directed its beam downward. The stone walls glistened with moisture for the first 20 feet or so, then became progressively drier. At about 60 feet down, she spotted it, a metal box resting on what appeared to be the dry, cracked bed of the well. I see it, she breathed. How do we get down there? There's an old well ladder bolted to the side, Mike said, pointing. Your father had me check it before we lowered the box. It should hold, but it's been years since then. Sarah swept the flashlight beam along the wall, illuminating the metal rungs embedded in the stone. They looked ancient and rusted, hardly trustworthy. I'll go, Mike offered. No, Sarah said firmly. He left it for me. I need to do this. Mike studied her face for a moment, then nodded. I'll secure a rope to you, just in case. And I'll be right here. They found a length of sturdy rope in the barn. Mike tied it around Sarah's waist with the efficiency of someone who'd worked with livestock his entire life. She handed him the flashlight to hold steady as she lowered herself onto the first rung of the ladder. The metal creaked beneath her weight but held firm. Slowly, carefully, Sarah began her descent. The walls of the well closed around her, the circle of sky above growing smaller with each step. The air became cooler, damper, heavy with the scent of earth and stone. Mike kept the flashlight beam directed below her, illuminating the next few rungs and, further down, the metal box that awaited. About halfway down, one of the rungs gave way beneath her foot. Sarah gasped, clutching desperately at the ladder as she fell a short distance before catching herself. The rope around her waist pulled tight. "Sarah!" Mike's voice echoed down the well. "You all right?" "I'm fine," she called back, her voice shaking. "Just a bad rung." She continued downward, testing each metal bar before trusting it with her weight. The well seemed to go on forever, though she knew from childhood that it was about 70 feet deep. Finally, her foot touched solid ground. The dry bed of the well was cracked clay, hard as concrete. "I made it," she called up to Mike. In the narrow beam of the flashlight, she could see the metal box clearly now. It was about the size of a large toolbox, made of stainless steel with a combination lock securing its lid. "Can you see inside?" Mike's voice sounded distant from above. "It's locked." Another combination. Sarah knelt beside the box, examining it closely. There were no markings, no hint of what might be inside. She tried to lift it, surprised by its weight. Whatever it contained was substantial. "I'm going to try some combinations," she called up. The lock was a standard 4-digit tumbler. Sarah tried her father's birthday, 0317, with no success. Then her mother's, 0524. Nothing. Her own, 0809. Still locked. She sat back on her heels, frustration mounting. What number would her father have chosen, knowing she would be the one to find it? Something significant to both of them, something she would remember. Then it struck her. The date she'd left home, June 12, 1990. The day everything had changed between them. Sarah's hands trembled as she turned the tumblers to 0612. The lock clicked open. "I got it," she called up to Mike, her voice echoing against the stone walls. With trembling hands, she lifted the lid. The contents were wrapped in oilcloth, carefully protected from moisture. Sarah unwrapped the first bundle to reveal a stack of letters bound with twine. They were addressed to her, each envelope sealed, dated sequentially over the past 15 years. The topmost bore her maiden name and her Chicago address from a decade ago. "Letters," she whispered, loud enough for Mike to hear. "He wrote me letters." But he had never sent them. Instead, he'd kept them, accumulating them like a silent diary of all the things he'd never said to her face. Beneath the letters was a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with her father's cramped handwriting. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped in soft cloth, was a metal object that made Sarah's breath catch. Her mother's locket, the one that had disappeared after her death 20 years ago. Sarah had assumed her father had buried it with her mother, a final token of his love. But here it was, nestled in velvet, the gold still gleaming despite years and darkness. There was something else in the box as well, a manila envelope, sealed and marked with a single word in her father's handwriting, proof. "Sarah?" Mike's voice echoed down. "What is it?" "I'm not sure yet," she replied, gathering the box into her arms. "I'm coming up." The climb back up was more difficult, balancing the heavy box while navigating the treacherous ladder. When she was halfway up, Mike began pulling on the rope, helping to support her weight. Finally, she emerged into the sunlight, squinting against its sudden brightness. Mike helped her out of the well, steadying her as she set the box on the ground. His eyes widened as he saw the contents. "He wrote to you all those years?" Sarah nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "Never sent a single one." "That sounds like James," Mike said softly. "Too stubborn to reach out, too loving to let go completely." Sarah picked up the envelope marked proof and turned it over in her hands. "There's something else here. Something he thought was important enough to hide." She broke the seal and slid out the contents, a stack of papers, some official documents with county letterheads, others handwritten notes. On top was a map of the farm, marked with annotations in her father's handwriting. Several areas were circled in red, including the location of the well. "What is all this?" Mike asked, peering over her shoulder. Sarah flipped through the papers, her confusion growing. Property records, water rights agreements, geological surveys. She paused, her finger tracing a line on one of the documents. And test results. Water contamination tests. The final page was a letter from the Midwestern Agricultural Corporation, dated 5 years earlier. It was an offer to purchase the Mitchell farm for a sum that made Sarah's eyes widen, 3 times what the property was worth even in its prime. "They wanted to buy him out," she murmured. "Why would they offer so much?" Mike took the letter from her, his expression darkening as he read. "Midwestern AG? They've been buying up all the farms around here for the past decade. Converting everything to industrial operations. Your father was one of the holdouts. But why would they offer so much for a struggling farm?" Sarah pressed. "It doesn't make sense." She returned to the geological surveys, studying them more carefully. They showed cross-sections of the land beneath the farm, layers of soil and rock stretching down hundreds of feet. But what caught her attention were the markings indicating a massive aquifer deep beneath the property, much deeper than the well. "The water," she said slowly, the pieces beginning to fall into place. "It's about the water." "What do you mean?" "Look at these surveys. There's an enormous aquifer under this land. It's just deeper than the well could reach." Mike frowned. "That can't be right. The whole county's been in a water shortage for years. That's why so many farms have failed." Sarah spread out the documents, moving quickly now as understanding dawned. "That's what they wanted everyone to believe. Look at these contamination reports. My father had the water tested repeatedly, documenting increasing levels of chemicals in the groundwater. Chemicals that match the fertilizers and pesticides used by Midwestern AG's operations." "You're saying they deliberately contaminated the water table?" Mike's voice was incredulous. "The shallow water table, yes. To force small farmers out. But look here," Sarah pointed to a notation on the survey. "There's a layer of impermeable shale protecting the deeper aquifer. They couldn't reach that water without drilling equipment that costs millions. But once they owned all the land, they could drill as deep as they wanted and control the entire water supply for the region," Mike finished, his expression grim. Sarah nodded, flipping back to the map of the farm. The areas her father had circled corresponded to test sites, places where he'd documented the contamination. The well was marked as original evidence, first detection. "He discovered what they were doing," she said quietly. "And they knew he knew." Mike's face paled slightly. "Sarah, your father's heart attack, it was never conclusively explained. The doctors said it could have been stress, but..." The implication hung in the air between them. Sarah felt a cold weight settling in her stomach. "You think they had something to do with his death?" "I'm not saying that," Mike backpedaled. "But he was scared those last few years. Kept his shotgun closer than usual. Asked me to check in on him daily." Sarah returned to the documents, scanning them with growing urgency. There, attached to one of the county letters, was a name she recognized, Edward Holloway, CEO of Midwestern Agricultural Corporation. The same man who had sent condolences after her father's death, expressing interest in purchasing the farm to preserve his legacy. "I need to take these into town," Sarah said, gathering the papers. "The county prosecutor needs to see this." "It won't be that simple," Mike warned. "Midwestern AG practically owns this county now. They've got people in every office. Then I'll go to the state. Or the EPA. Someone will listen." Mike shook his head. "Your father tried that route. These documents," he gestured to the box, "they're copies. He sent the originals to regulators 2 years ago. Nothing came of it. Then why hide all this in the well? Why tell me to find it?" Sarah demanded, frustration building. Insurance, maybe, Mike suggested. Or he wanted you to know the truth about why he stayed, why he fought so hard for this land when everyone else was selling out. Sarah was silent for a moment, absorbing the weight of her father's solitary battle. He hadn't been a bitter old man clinging to a dying farm out of stubbornness. He'd been protecting something vital, something that extended beyond property lines and family feuds. "Let's get these inside," she said finally. "I need to read the letters." They carried the box back to the farmhouse, setting it on the kitchen table that still bore the knife marks and coffee rings of Sarah's childhood. As Mike made a fresh pot of coffee, Sarah opened the first letter, dated just weeks after she'd left home. "Dear Sarah," it began in her father's precise handwriting. "I said things I didn't mean. Pride is a poison, and I've swallowed too much of it." Tears blurred her vision as she read his awkward attempts at reconciliation, his updates about the farm, his questions about her new life. Each letter revealed a different facet of the father she had never truly known, his loneliness after her departure, his quiet pride when he'd read about her successes in a Chicago newspaper, his grief when her mother's roses finally died during a particularly harsh winter. And in later letters, his growing suspicions about Midwestern AG, his determination to protect the land that had sustained generations of Mitchells. The final letter, dated just a month before his death, contained a confession that made Sarah's hands shake. "I was wrong to cut you out of my life," he had written. "Fear made me cruel. I was afraid you'd end up like your mother, tied to this land, to me, to a life that slowly drained the joy from her. When you chose to leave with Richard, I told myself it was betrayal. But it was the same choice I should have given your mother, the freedom to choose her own path. By the time I understood that, it seemed too late to reach out. Too many years had passed in silence." "What did he mean about your mother?" Mike asked quietly from across the table, where he'd been silently witnessing her journey through the letters. Sarah looked up, surprised. "You didn't know? My mother wanted to leave the farm. She had dreams of going back to school, moving to Kansas City. But my father refused to leave. They fought about it for years." Understanding dawned in Mike's eyes. "And when you left with Richard, it must have felt like history repeating itself," Sarah finished. "Except I got away, and she never did." She returned to the letter, reading the final paragraphs. "I found something that changes everything, proof that Midwestern AG has been systematically poisoning the water table to drive farmers out. They want the land for what lies beneath it, a massive untapped aquifer that could make them millions in water rights alone. I'm gathering evidence, but they know I'm onto them. Strange cars drive by the farm at night. The phone line gets interference. I've hidden everything in the well." It seemed fitting, somehow. The letter ended with words that made Sarah's heart ache. "If you're reading this, it means something has happened to me. I've instructed Mike to make sure you come home if anything does. The farm is yours now, along with the burden of this knowledge. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for so many things. Most of all, I'm sorry we lost all these years to my pride. I hope someday you can forgive me. I love you, always. Dad." Sarah set the letter down, feeling the weight of her father's final confession. He knew they might come after him. Mike nodded grimly. "The question is, what do we do now? Those documents alone aren't enough to bring down a corporation like Midwestern AG. We need more proof," Sarah said, flipping back through the geological surveys. "Current readings from the well, new water samples." She paused, studying the map again. "And we need to find out what's at these other marked locations." Mike leaned forward, examining the map. "This one," he said, pointing to a circle near the north property line, "that's where the new irrigation system pulls from. If they've been contaminating the water, that's where we'd find the strongest evidence." "Then that's where we start," Sarah said, rising from the table. As they prepared to leave, the sound of tires on gravel caught their attention. Sarah moved to the front window, peering out through dusty curtains. A black SUV with tinted windows had pulled up in front of the house. "Were you expecting company?" Mike asked, coming to stand beside her. Sarah shook her head, watching as two men in suits emerged from the vehicle. One carried a leather portfolio, his expression professionally neutral as he surveyed the property. The other seemed more alert, his eyes scanning the farmyard with practiced efficiency. "Midwestern AG," Sarah whispered. "Has to be." Mike's hand moved instinctively to the shotgun he'd left propped by the door. "How would they know you're here?" "The lawyer who handled my father's will, Grayson, he mentioned the farm had garnered some interest from buyers. Maybe he told them I was coming to assess the property." The men were approaching the porch now. Sarah quickly gathered the documents, shoving them back into the metal box. "Hide these," she whispered urgently to Mike. "I'll stall them." As Mike disappeared down the hallway with the box, Sarah composed herself and opened the front door just as the first man raised his hand to knock. "Ms. Mitchell," he inquired with a practiced smile. "I'm David Holloway, Executive Director of Community Relations for Midwestern Agricultural Corporation. This is my colleague, Robert Mercer. We heard you'd returned to settle your father's estate and thought we'd stop by to express our condolences." Sarah's pulse quickened at the name Holloway. The man before her was younger than the CEO mentioned in the documents, a son, perhaps, or nephew. "That's very kind of you," she replied, not inviting them in. "Though I'm curious how you knew I was here." David Holloway's smile didn't waver. "Small town. News travels fast. Your father was well respected in this community, despite his traditional approach to farming. We had hoped to partner with him while he was alive, but perhaps we might have better luck discussing options with you." "Options?" "For the future of this property," Holloway clarified, gesturing to encompass the farm. "As you can see, it's fallen into disrepair. Bringing it back to productive use would require significant investment that few individual farmers can afford these days." Sarah leaned against the doorframe, deliberately casual. "And Midwestern AG is prepared to make that investment?" "We are," Holloway confirmed, opening his portfolio. "In fact, I've brought an offer that I think you'll find quite generous. Significantly above market value, considering the condition of the structures and equipment." He extended a document toward her, a formal purchase offer with a figure that matched the one in her father's hidden documents. 3 times what the farm was worth on paper. "That's very generous," Sarah said, not taking the paper. "But I've only just arrived. I haven't had time to assess the property myself or consider my options." The second man, Mercer, spoke for the first time. His voice was deeper, colder than Holloway's. "With respect, Ms. Mitchell, you've been away from farming for what, 15 years? The agricultural landscape has changed dramatically. Small family operations like this are simply no longer viable." "Perhaps," Sarah conceded. "But it's still my decision to make, on my timeline." Holloway's smile tightened slightly. "Of course. We don't mean to pressure you. But I should mention that our offer is time-sensitive. We're consolidating operations in this region, and this property is particularly well situated for our needs." "Because of the water," Sarah said, watching their reactions closely. A flicker of something, surprise, concern, passed across Holloway's features before his professional demeanor reasserted itself. "Water rights are certainly a consideration for any agricultural operation. Your father's well ran dry years ago, but with proper investment, new drilling techniques could potentially access deeper reserves." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "My father was always protective of this land. Said it had value beyond what showed on the surface." Mercer shifted his weight, his eyes drifting past Sarah into the house. "Your father had certain, outdated ideas about modern agriculture. He made accusations against our company that were thoroughly investigated and dismissed." "Investigated by whom?" Sarah asked sharply. "County regulators, state environmental agencies," Holloway interjected smoothly. "All found no basis for his concerns. We respected his right to his opinions, of course, but facts are facts. There was no evidence of the kind of contamination he alleged." "Because they control those agencies," Sarah thought, remembering her father's letters. Out loud, she said, "I'll need time to consider your offer." A few weeks at least. We were hoping, Mercer began, but Holloway cut him off with a raised hand. A week, Holloway countered. We can give you a week to consider. After that, I'm afraid the offer will be substantially reduced. Market forces, you understand. Sarah straightened, meeting his gaze directly. A week it is, then. If you'll leave the paperwork, I'll review it. Holloway handed over the portfolio. My card is inside. Call anytime with questions. He paused, his smile never reaching his eyes. And Ms. Mitchell? I'd caution against pursuing any of your father's projects. They caused him considerable stress in his final years. Stress that his heart couldn't handle. The implied threat hung in the air between them. Sarah accepted the portfolio with steady hands, though her heart hammered in her chest. Thank you for the advice, Mr. Holloway. And for the offer. I'll be in touch. She closed the door as they retreated, watching through the window as they returned to their vehicle. Only when the SUV had disappeared down the long driveway did she allow herself to exhale. Mike emerged from the back of the house, his expression grim. You heard? Sarah nodded, dropping the portfolio on a side table. They as good as admitted they caused my father's heart attack. We need to be careful, Sarah. These people aren't just businessmen. That second guy, Mercer. I recognize him. Ex-military or private security. He's been seen around town whenever there's trouble with landowners who won't sell. Sarah sank into a chair, the full weight of her situation settling over her. She had returned to the farm expecting to find a dilapidated property to sell, perhaps some family mementos to sort through. Instead, she had stumbled into a conspiracy that had likely cost her father his life, one that now threatened her as well. We have 1 week, she said finally. 1 week to gather enough evidence to expose what they're doing. Mike nodded solemnly. 1 week to finish what your father started. As the afternoon sun slanted through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards, Sarah felt a resolve hardening within her. The farm wasn't just land and buildings, it was her father's final stand, his legacy of protection rather than possession. For 15 years, she had carried the wound of his rejection, never understanding the depth of what he was fighting for. Now she knew. And knowing changed everything. The morning after the visit from Midwestern AG, Sarah woke before dawn. She hadn't slept well, her dreams filled with wells that never ended and voices that echoed from their depths. Outside her window, the eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, the stars fading one by one. It would be a clear day, perfect for what they needed to do. Sarah dressed quickly in jeans and a flannel shirt she'd found in the back of her closet, surprisingly still her size after all these years. Downstairs, she made coffee in the ancient percolator, the familiar gurgle stirring memories of childhood mornings when her mother would be up first, preparing breakfast before the day's work began. Mike arrived just as the sun was breaking over the horizon, his truck loaded with equipment. They had formed their plan the previous evening: gather water samples from each of the locations marked on her father's map, document the current state of the contamination, and find some way to prove Midwestern AG's deliberate involvement. Morning, he greeted, accepting the mug of coffee she offered. Ready for this? Sarah nodded, the weight of their task settling on her shoulders. As ready as I'll ever be. They started at the irrigation pump on the north property line. Mike had brought testing kits, simple chemical indicators that would show the presence of specific pesticides and fertilizer compounds. Sarah watched as he collected water samples in sterile containers, labeling each one carefully. Your father taught me how to do this, Mike said, holding a vial up to the light. When he first suspected something was wrong, he wanted backup. Someone else who could verify what he was seeing. Sarah felt a pang of guilt. He shouldn't have had to face this alone. He wasn't alone, Mike said quietly. Not completely. The test results were immediate and disturbing. The water showed high levels of the same chemical compounds documented in her father's records, but at concentrations nearly twice as high. It's getting worse, Sarah murmured, recording the readings in a notebook. The contamination is spreading. They moved systematically through the property, checking each location marked on the map. Every test showed the same pattern: increasing contamination, spreading outward from the Midwestern AG properties that surrounded the Mitchell farm on 3 sides. By midday, they had collected enough samples to confirm her father's suspicions. But as Mike had pointed out the day before, water tests alone wouldn't be enough to prove deliberate action by the corporation. They needed something more definitive. "What about the property line?" Sarah suggested, studying the map again. "My father marked something here, right at the boundary with the Peterson place." Mike frowned. "The Petersons sold to Midwestern 5 years ago. That's all corporate land now." "Exactly. If they're introducing contaminants into the water table, they'd have to do it from their own property." They drove to the southeastern corner of the farm, where a barbed wire fence marked the boundary between Mitchell land and what had once belonged to the Peterson family. The area was mostly uncultivated, a stretch of prairie grass and scrub brush that had been deemed too rocky for efficient farming. Sarah scanned the landscape, trying to discern what had drawn her father's attention. Nothing seemed unusual, just wild grass swaying in the breeze, a few scattered trees, the remnants of an old cattle fence. "There," Mike said suddenly, pointing toward a metal structure partially hidden by tall grass about 50 yards beyond the property line. "That wasn't there when the Petersons owned this land." Sarah squinted against the sunlight. The structure looked like a small pump house, the kind used to house irrigation equipment. But there were no crops in this area, no visible reason for irrigation. "We need to get a closer look," she said. Mike hesitated. "That's trespassing, Sarah. If they catch us on their property, we won't cross the line," she assured him. "Just get close enough to see what that structure is." They approached the fence cautiously, keeping low in the grass. Sarah had brought binoculars from the house, an old pair that had belonged to her father. Through the lenses, she could make out details of the pump house, newer than most of the structures in the area, with a padlocked door and what appeared to be monitoring equipment mounted on the exterior. "It's some kind of injection well," Mike said, studying it through the binoculars after she passed them to him. "See those pipes? They're going straight down, not out to fields." Sarah felt a chill despite the midday heat. "They're not taking water out. They're putting something in. But why? Contaminating their own water supply doesn't make sense." Sarah thought back to the geological surveys in her father's documents. The shale layer, the one protecting the deep aquifer. What if it isn't continuous? What if there are natural breaks, places where the upper and lower water tables connect? Understanding dawned on Mike's face. They're finding those connection points and introducing contaminants there, knowing they'll spread through the upper aquifer but not reach the lower one. "Exactly," Sarah said. "They poison the shallow wells that most small farms rely on, while the deeper aquifer, the one they plan to tap once they own all the land, remains protected." "That's diabolical," Mike whispered. "And illegal," Sarah added. "We need proof that's what this structure is doing." They were so focused on the pump house that neither of them noticed the approach of the black SUV until its engine sound was unmistakable. Sarah turned to see the vehicle bouncing across the uneven ground toward them, dust billowing in its wake. "We need to go," Mike said urgently, taking her arm. "Now." They rushed back toward Mike's truck, parked 100 yards away near an old oak tree. Sarah clutched the notebook containing their test results against her chest as they ran. They had just reached the vehicle when the SUV pulled up, blocking their path. Robert Mercer stepped out, his expression cold. Unlike the previous day, he wore no suit jacket, and Sarah could see the outline of a holstered weapon beneath his shirt. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, his tone conversational despite the tension crackling in the air. "Out for a stroll?" "Just checking fence lines," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Part of my property assessment." Mercer's eyes flicked to the notebook in her hands, then to the collection of sample vials visible through the open window of Mike's truck. "Interesting equipment for fence inspection," he observed. "Almost looks like you're conducting some kind of environmental survey." "The property's been neglected," Mike interjected. "Sarah wants to know what she's dealing with before making any decisions." Mercer smiled thinly. Of course. Due diligence. Though I'd advise against crossing property lines in your assessments. Midwestern AG takes security quite seriously. We haven't crossed any lines, Sarah said firmly. Everything we've done has been on Mitchell land. Good to hear. Mercer's gaze lingered on the sample vials again. Mr. Holloway was hoping you might have had time to review our offer. He's quite eager to reach an agreement. I told him I need a week, Sarah replied. Nothing's changed since yesterday. Mercer nodded slowly. A week it is, then. Though I should mention, we've had reports of vandalism at some of our monitoring stations recently. If you happen to notice any suspicious activity around the property boundaries, we'd appreciate a call. The threat was thinly veiled. Sarah met his gaze steadily. I'll be sure to report anything suspicious. With a final assessing look, Mercer returned to the SUV. They watched as it drove away, following the property line rather than returning the way it had come. They're watching us, Mike said once the vehicle had disappeared from view. They probably have been since you arrived. All the more reason to work quickly, Sarah replied. We need to document that injection well. Get photographs, more water samples from around it. Mike frowned. Sarah, you heard Mercer. If they catch us on their property, we can't let them intimidate us, she insisted. My father died trying to expose what they're doing. I won't back down now. And what happens if you end up like your father? Mike demanded, his voice rising with frustration. Another convenient heart attack? These people aren't playing games, Sarah. They've already killed once to protect their operation. Sarah fell silent, the reality of their situation sinking in. Mike was right, they were up against a corporation willing to go to extreme lengths to secure its interests. Two people with water samples and a notebook wouldn't stand a chance against Midwestern AG's resources and influence. We need help, she said finally. Someone with authority who can't be bought off. That's a short list around here, Mike replied grimly. Then we go beyond around here, Sarah said. Federal level. EPA, FBI, someone who can investigate without local interference. Mike considered this, then nodded slowly. I might know someone who can help. College buddy who works for the EPA regional office in Kansas City. He's been concerned about some of the water quality reports from this area for years, but never had enough evidence to launch a full investigation. Call him, Sarah said decisively. Tell him we have what he needs. They returned to the farmhouse, spirits somewhat lifted by this new plan. As Mike made his call from the kitchen, Sarah sorted through her father's documents, organizing them chronologically to show the progression of the contamination. He'll meet us tomorrow, Mike announced after hanging up. In Blue Springs, about an hour from here. Says to bring everything we've got. Sarah nodded, relieved. We should gather the rest of the samples tonight. There are still 2 locations we haven't checked. As sunset approached, they drove to the southwestern corner of the property, where a small stream meandered through a stand of cottonwood trees. This had been one of Sarah's favorite spots as a child, a place where she would come to read or simply escape the demands of farm life for a few hours. The stream was barely a trickle now, choked with sediment and algae. Mike collected water samples while Sarah photographed the visible evidence of contamination, the unnatural coloration of the water, the absence of the frogs and minnows that had once been abundant here. One more stop, she said as they finished. The old cattle pond. The pond lay in a shallow depression about a quarter mile from the house. Like the stream, it had once been a vibrant ecosystem, home to countless species of birds and aquatic life. Now it was a toxic pool, its surface coated with an oily film that reflected the colors of the setting sun in sickly rainbows. As Mike prepared to take samples, Sarah wandered a few yards away, drawn to a sight that seemed out of place, a patch of vibrant green amid the withered grass surrounding the pond. Upon closer inspection, she discovered it was a cluster of small plants, their delicate leaves distinctively shaped with 5 pointed lobes. Mike, she called, kneeling beside the plants. Come look at this. He joined her, crouching down to examine the vegetation. Never seen anything like that around here before. Sarah gently touched one of the leaves, remembering the photograph she'd found in her father's box, the scientists with trays of unusual plants. I think this might be it. The plant they derived their compound from. Mike carefully dug around one of the specimens, extracting it with its roots intact. We'll take it with us. Your EPA friend might be able to identify it. As they worked, the sound of an approaching vehicle caught their attention. Sarah's heart raced, expecting to see Mercer's SUV cresting the hill. Instead, a familiar pickup truck appeared, Ray Bennett's, the county sheriff. Great, Mike muttered. Just what we need. Sheriff Bennett was a heavy-set man in his 60s, his weathered face permanently creased into what seemed like a disapproving frown. He'd been sheriff for as long as Sarah could remember, an institution in the county almost as permanent as the courthouse itself. Evening, Mike, Bennett called as he climbed out of his truck. Ms. Mitchell. Heard you were back in town. Sheriff, Sarah acknowledged cautiously. What brings you out here? Just checking in, Bennett replied, his eyes moving to the sample containers in Mike's hands. Making sure everything's all right. Got a call about some potential trespassing concerns. We haven't left Mitchell property, Sarah said firmly. Bennett nodded slowly. Good to hear. Though I'm curious about what you're doing with all those water samples. Planning to reopen the farm? There was something in his tone, a forced casualness that immediately put Sarah on edge. Bennett had always been friendly with her father, or so she had thought. But if Midwestern AG controlled the county as thoroughly as her father had believed, the sheriff might well be on their payroll. Just assessing the property, she replied, echoing the explanation they'd given Mercer. Need to know what I'm working with. Bennett studied her for a moment, then shifted his gaze to Mike. Interesting timing, your return, he said to Sarah without looking away from Mike. Right when the county's reviewing water rights allocations for the next decade. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Is that so? Bennett confirmed. Big decisions being made. Decisions that could affect property values significantly. He finally looked back at Sarah. Just something to keep in mind while you're assessing. The implication was clear, take the money and leave before things get complicated. I appreciate your concern, Sheriff, Sarah said evenly. But I haven't decided what I'm doing with the farm yet. Bennett nodded, touching the brim of his hat. Well, I won't keep you. Just doing my rounds. You folks have a good evening. He turned to go, then added almost as an afterthought, oh, and Ms. Mitchell? Your daddy was a good man. Stubborn as they come, but good. Shame how things ended for him. After the sheriff had departed, Sarah and Mike finished collecting their samples in tense silence. The encounter had left them both shaken, the network of Midwestern AG's influence becoming increasingly apparent. We need to leave tonight, Mike said as they loaded the last of their equipment into his truck. Drive straight to Kansas City. It's not safe to wait until morning. Sarah nodded her agreement. I'll pack my father's documents and the letters. Everything else we can leave. They returned to the farmhouse, working quickly to gather the essential evidence. As Sarah packed her father's letters into her bag, she hesitated over the locket she'd found in the metal box. She opened it carefully, revealing the tiny photographs inside, her mother on one side, a much younger Sarah on the other. With trembling fingers, she fastened it around her neck, its weight both unfamiliar and comforting. Ready? Mike asked from the doorway. Almost, Sarah replied. There's one more thing I need to do. She took a sheet of paper from the kitchen drawer and wrote a brief note. I know what you did to my father. I know about the wells, the contamination, the aquifer. Evidence has been secured and distributed to multiple parties. If anything happens to me or to Mike Lawson, it all goes public immediately. The farm is not for sale, not now, not ever. She signed it simply S. Mitchell and left it on the kitchen table, where it would be easily found by whoever came looking for them. Now I'm ready, she said, joining Mike on the porch. Night had fallen completely, the sky ablaze with stars visible only in places far from city lights. The familiar constellations of Sarah's childhood stretched across the darkness, unchanged despite the years and distance that had separated her from this land. As they drove down the long gravel driveway, Sarah looked back at the farmhouse, a dark silhouette against the starry sky. Whatever happened next, she knew she would return. This land was part of her, just as it had been part of her father and mother before her. The Mitchell farm was worth fighting for, not for its market value but for what it represented, a stand against corporate greed, a protection of resources meant for all, a legacy of stewardship rather than exploitation. The meeting with Mike's EPA contact the next day exceeded their expectations. Alan Prescott was a serious man with wire-rimmed glasses and a methodical approach that immediately inspired confidence. He examined their evidence, the water samples, soil tests, plant specimen, and her father's meticulous documentation, with growing concern. "This is exactly what we've been looking for," he told them, carefully placing the samples in a secure container. Proof of deliberate contamination, documentation of the pattern, and most importantly, evidence of motive. "Is it enough?" Sarah asked. "Enough to stop them?" Prescott nodded slowly. "It's enough to launch a federal investigation, which means protection for both of you and preservation of the evidence. Once the investigation is public, it becomes much harder for them to operate in the shadows." "And the farm?" Mike asked. "They're still pressuring Sarah to sell." "Don't," Prescott advised firmly. "That land is now key evidence in what could become the largest water rights case in the state's history. Selling would complicate things enormously." He turned to Sarah. "Can you hold out?" Sarah thought of her father's 15-year stand against Midwestern AG, his solitary battle to protect not just his own land but the water resources for the entire region. She thought of the letters he'd written but never sent, his regret for the years lost to pride and stubbornness. And she thought of her own flight from the farm, her determination never to return. "Yes," she said firmly. "I can hold out." The next week passed in a whirlwind of activity. Sarah and Mike provided formal statements to federal investigators, handed over all their evidence, and watched as EPA teams descended on the Mitchell farm and surrounding Midwestern AG properties. The injection well they had discovered was shut down pending investigation, along with several others found on adjacent properties. David Holloway made no further attempts to contact Sarah directly, though his lawyers sent increasingly desperate offers for the farm, each higher than the last. She declined them all with the same simple response: "The Mitchell farm is not for sale." Robert Mercer disappeared the day after the federal investigation was announced. Sheriff Bennett suddenly retired, citing health concerns. And the county officials who had ignored her father's reports were now facing their own investigations for potential corruption and negligence. 1 month after her return to the farm, Sarah stood beside the well, its metal lid now permanently sealed. The property around her was alive with activity, EPA scientists monitoring groundwater, agricultural experts assessing soil recovery options, journalists documenting what was rapidly becoming a landmark environmental case. Mike joined her, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "Penny for your thoughts?" Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, breathing in its rich aroma. "I was thinking about my father. Whether he knew all of this would happen when he hid those documents in the well." "I don't think anyone could have predicted this," Mike replied, gesturing to the bustle of activity around the farm. "But he knew you'd do the right thing when the time came. He believed in you, even when he couldn't say it." Sarah touched the locket at her throat, a habit she developed over the past month. 15 years, she murmured. 15 years we lost to pride and misunderstanding." "Not lost," Mike corrected gently. "Just delayed. Look what you've accomplished in a month. Imagine what you'll do now that you're home." Home. The word resonated within her. This farm, for all its painful memories and recent trauma, was indeed home. It had shaped her, challenged her, driven her away, and finally called her back when she had nowhere else to go. "I'm staying," she said, the decision crystallizing as she spoke it aloud. "Not just until the case is settled. Permanently." Mike's expression brightened. What about Chicago? Your life there? Sarah shook her head. There's nothing for me in Chicago anymore. Richard is gone. Our apartment is gone. My job. She trailed off, thinking of the marketing firm that had let her go after her extended leave to care for her dying husband. It was never really what I wanted anyway. And what do you want? Mike asked quietly. Sarah looked out over the land, the fields that would need to be rehabilitated, the house that needed repair, the future waiting to be shaped. To finish what my father started. Not just fighting Midwestern AG, but making this farm work again. Differently this time. Sustainably. Mike nodded, understanding in his eyes. It won't be easy. The best things rarely are, Sarah replied, thinking of her father's final letter, his acknowledgement of mistakes made and chances lost. But I'm not alone this time. Neither of us is. Later that evening, as sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and gold, Sarah sat on the porch steps, a bundle of her father's unsent letters in her lap. She had been reading them one by one, discovering the father she had never truly known, his regrets, his hopes, his unwavering love despite the silence between them. The last letter remained unopened, save for this moment. Sarah broke the seal carefully, unfolding the paper to reveal her father's familiar handwriting, more unsteady than in earlier letters. My dearest Sarah, it began, if you're reading this, then you've found what I left for you in the well. You've discovered the truth I fought to protect and the battle I couldn't finish alone. I don't know what you'll choose to do with this knowledge, but I trust that whatever path you take will be the right one. Tears blurred her vision as she continued reading. I made many mistakes in my life, but none greater than letting my pride keep you away. I told myself I was protecting this land for future generations, for your children someday, but the truth is simpler and harder to admit. I was afraid. Afraid of change, afraid of loss, afraid of a world that was moving too fast for an old farmer to keep up. The Mitchell farm has been in our family for 4 generations. It has weathered dust storms, tornadoes, depressions, and droughts. But its greatest test came not from nature but from greed, the belief that resources like water, air, and soil can be owned rather than stewarded. Whatever you decide to do with the farm, remember this: the land doesn't belong to us, we belong to the land. It holds our history, shapes our character, and connects us to something larger than ourselves. I fought to protect that connection, even when I failed to protect the most important connection of all, the one between you and me. I love you, Sarah. I have always loved you, even in my silence. And I am proud of the woman you've become, even from a distance. May you find in this place not just answers but peace. And may you forgive an old man who took too long to learn that love matters more than pride, and that some treasures, once lost, can never be fully recovered. With all my heart, your father. Sarah folded the letter carefully, holding it against her heart as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The well was sealed now, its secrets revealed, its purpose fulfilled. But the land remained, stretching out around her in all directions, alive with possibility and renewed purpose. From the driveway came the sound of a car approaching, Mike returning from town with supplies for tomorrow's work. There was so much to be done, soil to heal, structures to repair, wrongs to right. The road ahead would not be easy, but it would be traveled together, the burden shared, the journey guided by the lessons of the past. Sarah tucked the letter into her pocket and rose to her feet, ready to welcome Mike home. The Mitchell farm had called her back, not as a last resort but as a final homecoming. The dried well had yielded its secrets, the town had faced its complicity, and Sarah had found her place at last, not fleeing from the past but building on its foundation, honoring her father's fight by continuing it in her own way. The land remained, as it always had, patient beneath the changing sky, waiting for those who would tend it with love and understanding, waiting for those who recognized that its true value lay not in what could be taken from it but in what it freely gave to those who belonged to it, body and soul. 5 years passed like the changing seasons, gradually, inevitably, one day flowing into the next until Sarah could hardly remember a time when the Mitchell farm hadn't been her home again. The federal investigation into Midwestern Agricultural Corporation had culminated in one of the largest environmental settlements in state history. Executives faced criminal charges, shell companies were dismantled, and millions of dollars were allocated for groundwater remediation across the county. The Mitchell farm stood as the epicenter of it all, both the place where the conspiracy had been exposed and the model for recovery. The morning dew glistened on the newly planted winter wheat as Sarah walked the eastern field, clipboard in hand. The rehabilitation of the soil had been a painstaking process, years of careful amendments, cover crops, and patience. But the earth was responding, gradually returning to life after decades of abuse. "Looking good," called a voice from behind her. Mike approached along the tractor path, 2 steaming mugs in hand. Their morning walks had become ritual, a quiet moment together before the day's demands took over. Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully. "The nitrogen levels are almost normal. Another season and we might be ready for certification. Organic status on a farm this size, your father would never have believed it," Mike said with a smile, his free arm slipping naturally around her waist. Their relationship had evolved as organically as the recovering soil beneath their feet, friendship deepening to partnership, partnership to love, all of it rooted in shared purpose and mutual respect. They had married 3 years ago in a simple ceremony under the old oak tree, witnessed by the handful of neighbors who had stood by them through the darkest days of the investigation. "He might have been more skeptical about the solar irrigation system," Sarah replied, nodding toward the array of panels that powered the new well, drilled to a carefully monitored depth that accessed clean water without threatening the deeper aquifer. "But he would have appreciated the independence." Independence had become the cornerstone of their operation. While neighboring farms that had been caught in Midwestern AG's web were still struggling to recover, the Mitchell farm had transformed into something new, smaller in scale but more diverse, growing specialty organic crops for regional markets rather than commodity grains for corporate buyers. "Speaking of independence," Mike said, "Abigail called from the university. Their analysis of that plant sample is finally complete." Sarah's pulse quickened. The unusual 5-lobed plants they had discovered by the pond had proven as significant as they had suspected. "And? It's a hybrid. Part natural, part engineered. They think your father was right, Midwestern created it specifically to transport contaminants through the water table. The roots grow toward chemical signatures in the soil. So they could target specific areas for contamination," Sarah murmured. "Directed away from their own deep wells." Mike nodded. "But here's the twist, the plant also has remarkable filtration properties. Once established, it can actually remove certain toxins from the soil." He squeezed her shoulder gently. "Your father didn't just find evidence of their crime, he might have inadvertently discovered part of the solution." Sarah closed her eyes briefly, feeling the weight of her father's legacy. James Mitchell, stubborn, flawed, visionary in ways even he hadn't fully understood. "We should expand the test plots then. If it can help other farms recover." "Abigail's already working on a grant proposal," Mike confirmed. "The Mitchell-Lawson Soil Recovery Project." The name brought a smile to Sarah's face. Their work had expanded beyond the boundaries of the farm, reaching out to neighboring properties still struggling with contaminated groundwater. What had begun as a fight for justice had evolved into a mission of restoration, not just for their land but for the entire community. They walked on toward the farmhouse, now restored to its former charm with fresh white paint and a wraparound porch where Sarah often sat in the evenings, reading her father's letters. She had preserved them all, keeping them in the same metal box he had hidden in the well, a tangible reminder of words unsaid and time lost. The house was quiet this morning, their 2 farmhands not due to arrive for another hour. Sarah and Mike had built a small but dedicated team, mostly young agriculture students eager to learn sustainable farming practices, rotating through season by season as they completed their studies. Inside, Sarah paused before the framed document hanging in the entryway, the conservation easement that permanently protected the Mitchell farm from development or industrial agriculture. It had been her first major decision after the settlement, ensuring that regardless of what happened to her or Mike, the land would remain as they had restored it, a living monument to what had nearly been lost. "The school bus is coming at 10, Mike reminded her as they settled at the kitchen table. Fifth graders this time. Sarah nodded, making a mental note to prepare the demonstration plots. The educational program had been Emily's idea, their niece, Mike's sister's daughter, who had joined them on the farm 3 summers ago and never left. At 25, Emily brought fresh energy and innovative thinking to their operation, transforming a portion of the property into a living classroom where local schools could learn about sustainable agriculture, water conservation, and environmental stewardship. "I'll have the well model ready," Sarah promised. The scaled replica of the farm's original well had become a centerpiece of their educational tours, telling the story of water contamination and recovery through hands-on demonstrations that children could understand. The kitchen filled with morning light as they reviewed the day's tasks. Beyond the window, Sarah could see the experimental garden where they cultivated the 5-lobed plants under careful conditions, studying their remediation properties while ensuring they didn't spread unchecked. Beyond that, the repurposed barn housed their small processing facility, where specialty crops were prepared for local restaurants and farmers markets. "Did you see the registry letter?" Mike asked, sliding an official-looking envelope across the table. Sarah picked it up, already knowing its contents. "It came yesterday." "And?" "I haven't decided yet." She turned the envelope over in her hands. The National Registry of Historic Places had expressed interest in designating the Mitchell Farm as a landmark, not just for its role in exposing environmental crimes, but for its ongoing significance as a model of rural regeneration. It would bring more attention, Mike noted. More visitors, more opportunities for education. More scrutiny, Sarah countered. More pressure. She sighed, setting the letter aside. "I need to think about it. This place has already become more public than I ever imagined." The irony wasn't lost on her. She had returned to the farm seeking solitude and closure, only to find herself at the center of a movement that drew people from across the country, farmers seeking guidance, researchers studying their methods, journalists documenting their story. The Mitchell Farm had become a symbol of resistance and renewal, its name synonymous with the fight for clean water and sustainable agriculture. The remainder of the morning passed in comfortable routine, checking irrigation systems, reviewing soil test results, preparing for the school group. Sarah found herself in the small greenhouse attached to the east side of the barn, tending to seedlings that would eventually be transplanted to the north field. Through the glass walls, she could see the full expanse of the property, the patchwork of fields in various stages of recovery, the windbreak of trees they had planted along the western boundary, the solar arrays gleaming in the strengthening sunlight. The Mitchell farm today bore little resemblance to the abandoned property she had inherited 5 years ago. Yet the essence remained, the curve of the land against the horizon, the way light played across the fields at dawn, the resilience that had sustained generations through drought and plenty. Her father would recognize it still, she thought. Different, but unquestionably home. A truck appeared on the long driveway, raising a plume of dust against the clear blue sky. Sarah recognized it immediately, Alan Prescott's vehicle, the EPA official who had become both ally and friend during the investigation. His visits were less frequent now that the case was closed, but he still stopped by periodically, maintaining the connection forged through shared purpose. Sarah met him on the porch, offering iced tea from the pitcher that stood ready for the day's heat. "Looking good, Mitchell," Prescott greeted her, accepting the glass gratefully. His once dark hair had silvered considerably over the 5 years, the stress of the Midwestern AG case having taken its toll. "Where's that husband of yours?" "Fixing irrigation lines in the west field," Sarah replied. "He'll be back soon." "What brings you out this way?" "Not more paperwork, I hope." Prescott smiled, settling into one of the porch chairs. "Actually, I've got news. The final appeal was denied yesterday. Holloway's sentence stands." Sarah nodded, absorbing this information. David Holloway had received 15 years for his role in the conspiracy, though his lawyers had fought the verdict through every available avenue. "And Mercer?" "Still missing," Prescott admitted. "But the international warrants remain active. He can't hide forever." The disappearance of Robert Mercer had been the one loose end in an otherwise comprehensive case. The security chief had vanished the day the investigation became public, presumably fleeing with corporate funds. Occasional reports placed him in various countries, always one step ahead of authorities. I didn't come just for that update, though, Prescott continued, reaching into his jacket pocket. I brought you something I thought you should have. He handed her a small flash drive, unmarked except for an official evidence tag. What's this? Sarah asked, turning it over in her palm. Security footage, Prescott explained. From St. Luke's Hospital, dated the night of your father's final heart attack. It was part of the sealed evidence, but now that the case is closed. He hesitated, studying her face. You don't have to view it. But I thought you deserved the choice. Sarah's fingers tightened around the flash drive. The question of her father's death, whether it had been natural or hastened by Midwestern AG, had never been definitively answered. The medical examiner had documented elevated stress levels and unusual chemical markers in his bloodstream, but nothing conclusive enough to prove homicide. Thank you, she said quietly. I'll think about it. Prescott nodded, understanding in his eyes. Whatever you decide, just know the case is closed. Your father's name has been cleared, his allegations confirmed. He was right all along. They talked a while longer, discussing the ongoing remediation efforts across the county and the legislative changes sparked by the case. New regulations govern agricultural water use throughout the state, with stricter monitoring of chemical applications and groundwater quality. The Mitchell farm had become a testing ground for these policies, a place where theory met practice in the ongoing work of restoration. After Prescott departed, Sarah found herself drawn to the old oak tree that dominated the front yard. Its massive trunk bore the scars of lightning strikes and windstorms, yet it stood firm, roots reaching deep into the soil that had sustained it for over a century. Beneath its spreading branches, she had married Mike, continuing a tradition begun by her grandparents generations earlier. She sat on the wooden bench they had placed there, the flash drive still clutched in her hand. Did she need to know the exact circumstances of her father's death? Would confirmation of her suspicions change anything about the path she had chosen? The distant sound of a tractor announced Mike's return from the fields. Sarah watched as he parked near the barn, his movements efficient and purposeful as he gathered tools. When he spotted her beneath the tree, he changed direction, coming to join her on the bench. Prescott brought this, she said without preamble, showing him the flash drive. Security footage from the hospital. The night my father died. Mike was silent for a moment, his weathered hand covering hers. Are you going to watch it? Sarah looked out across the farm, the land her father had protected with his life, the legacy he had preserved at such personal cost. I don't think I need to. Not anymore. The truth, she had come to understand, wasn't contained in a single moment captured on hospital cameras. It lived in the cumulative choices made across decades, her father's decision to stand against corporate pressure, her own choice to return and continue his work, their shared commitment to the land that had shaped them both. I was so angry with him for so long, she said softly. For cutting me out, for his stubbornness, for choosing the farm over everything else. I couldn't understand what held him here. And now? Mike prompted gently. Sarah smiled, tucking the flash drive into her pocket where it joined her father's locket, the two physical reminders of a journey that had come full circle. Now I understand that he never really chose the farm over me. He was trying to protect both, in the only way he knew how. The sound of approaching vehicles signaled the arrival of the school bus, yellow against the green fields. Emily emerged from the barn, waving to them as she prepared to greet the children. We should go help, Mike said, rising from the bench. Sarah nodded, but remained seated for a moment longer. I'm going to accept the registry designation, she decided. The Mitchell farm should stand for something beyond just us. It's what Dad would have wanted, the truth preserved, the story told. Mike squeezed her shoulder in silent agreement. Together they walked toward the driveway where the bus was discharging its excited passengers, 25 fifth graders eager to learn about soil and water, plants and sustainability, the delicate balance that sustained life on a small family farm in rural Kansas. Sarah watched as Emily organized the children into groups, her enthusiasm infectious as she explained the day's activities. From the youngest student to the oldest farmhand, the Mitchell-Lawson farm had become a place of continuity and renewal, where knowledge passed from one generation to the next in an unbroken chain. That evening, after the visitors had departed and the day's work was complete, Sarah returned to the oak tree. The setting sun painted the fields in gold and amber, the shadows lengthening across land that had witnessed both struggle and triumph. She carried her father's metal box, its contents now familiar from countless readings over the years. Beneath the tree, in a small hollow at its base, she carefully placed the box, letters, journal, locket, and flash drive together in their final resting place. Not hidden as her father had hidden them in the well, but preserved in the heart of the farm, protected by roots that reached deep into the soil he had defended. With a handful of fresh earth, she covered the box, patting the ground smooth. No marker was needed, she would always know it was there, just as she would always feel her father's presence in the land around her. The Mitchell farm would continue its story long after she was gone, each season adding new chapters to a narrative that had begun generations before her birth. As darkness fell, Sarah walked back toward the farmhouse where lights glowed in welcome. Mike waited on the porch, 2 glasses of wine poured for their evening ritual. Beyond him, she could see Emily in the kitchen, preparing dinner with the fresh vegetables they had harvested that morning. Family, Sarah reflected, not just those connected by blood but by shared purpose and commitment. Her father had fought alone for so many years, isolated by his knowledge and his pride. But his legacy had created something more enduring than he could have imagined, a community bound together by the truth he had preserved in that well. The Mitchell farm had come full circle, from a place of secrets and solitude to one of openness and connection. The dried well that had once held her father's desperate evidence now served as a teaching tool, its story helping a new generation understand the value of what lay beneath their feet. Water, soil, truth, the elements that sustained life in all its forms, worth protecting at any cost. Sarah joined Mike on the porch, accepting the glass he offered. Together they watched the first stars appear in the darkening sky, the same stars that had witnessed the farm's long journey from settlement to abandonment to renewal. Whatever came next, new challenges, new discoveries, new generations, the Mitchell-Lawson farm would face it as it had faced everything before, with patience, with resilience, with roots that reached deep and branches that stretched toward the future. The well had yielded its secrets, the land had begun to heal, and Sarah had found her place in the continuing story of a family farm that had nearly been lost but was now, finally, truly home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.